Disclaimer: if you're watching this video sometime after the upload, please check the pinned comment first before commenting. Clarifications and corrections will probably be found there. Listen to this rendition of a French song from the 12th century.
Et dame jolie, mon cœur sans fossé, mais en votre bailli, que ne sait vos pères, souvent me voit complaignant, et en mon cœur doux le sang d'une maladie.
Now listen to this alternative rendition of the exact same song.
Et dame jolie, mon cœur sans faussaire, mais en votre bailli, que ne sait mon père, souvent me voit complaignant, et en mon cœur doux le sang d'une maladie.
One of them, the second one, was a medieval arrangement of medieval music. By that I mean it used the actual medieval performative practices, the historically accurate practices of the actual Middle Ages. The first one, on the other hand, is what you would call a bardcore, neo-medieval or pseudo-medieval approach to a medieval song. And what we mean by that is that the music is arranged using the music theory and performative practices of today's modern Western world. And across the board, the medieval music that most people are acquainted with is not actually medieval. It's music that superficially sounds medieval, is medieval themed, but is not actually medieval in how the music is constructed. It doesn't necessarily use medieval instruments. It might use anachronistic instruments, and the whole music is arranged in a modern manner. That is what we refer to as bardcore, and that is predominantly the dominant form of medieval music that most people are going to be acquainted with. I'm sure if you're watching this video, you're thinking to yourself right now, well, I have some idea of what medieval music sounds like, and statistically the chances are that you've never actually heard medieval music arranged with the actual instruments, with the actual performative practices. If your idea of medieval music is gained from a collective of pop culture, from tavern songs, from MMORPGs and soundtracks, and those 1 hour of medieval Celtic ambient music on YouTube, and that band that was playing some music that sounded medieval to you at the medieval fair, then yeah, you've probably never actually heard real medieval music. You've heard bardcore music. And so through this video, we are going to differentiate the two without judgment towards bardcore. So important disclaimer here, I am not trying to expose bardcore musicians. They're very open about what they do, most of them at least. They don't claim to be reconstructing medieval music as it was. Bardcore is a modern genre with a medieval theme, and that's perfectly valid. That's a perfectly valid form of artistic expression, and I have nothing against it. I am not attacking the artists. I am simply describing in what ways bardcore is not actual medieval music and why one should not be confused for the other. As always with these kinds of videos, disclaimers are going to be necessary. And the first disclaimer is, if you're asking yourself, where's the music, I just want to hear the music, do everybody a favor. Click off this video and just go to my channel. There's a playlist with historically informed performances of medieval music. In the pinned comment of this video, there's going to be links to estimable ensembles that create historically informed performances of medieval music, and you can just move on with your life. So bye-bye. For those of you who have stayed, just listening to music is not enough to understand it. This video is about developing the intellectual framework from which you can then understand what you're listening to. You will know what to look for, because as you're going to see, the difference between bardcore music and actual medieval music is very difficult to understand if you're not well versed in some aspects of music theory, modern or medieval music theory. Second disclaimer, yes, we do know what medieval European music sounded like. I have to put this out there at the very beginning of the video because there's always people on videos like these who love to leave comments saying, we know nothing about their music, there's no way to know anyway. In order to even say that there's no way to know what medieval European music sounded like, you have to have not done any research whatsoever on the subject. If you do any basic research, even surface level research, you will know that not only we do know what their music sounded like, the reason why we do know what it sounded like is because we have many surviving compositions from the European Middle Ages. We're not at all starving when it comes to compositions from the era. But perhaps most importantly, we have access to treatises and essays that tell us from the mouths, or at least the pens, of medieval musicians and medieval music theorists themselves, how their music functioned. Now, I don't want to claim that we know absolutely everything there is to know about medieval European music. There's many places in which historical reconstructions of medieval music are speculative at best, but these are mostly the details. Whilst obviously not everything is understood from the European Middle Ages, the general soundscape of the Middle Ages is very much understood because we have a lot of evidence. Third and final disclaimer. In this video, when we're talking about medieval music, we are talking about music that adheres to the principles of medieval music theory and performative practices. So in the context of this video, an original piece of music written today that is performed with adherence to medieval performance practices is going to be considered medieval and historically accurate, whereas a sequence of notes written down in 1200s performed in a modern manner is not going to be considered medieval. It is going to be considered bardcore and ahistorical. To give you an example, imagine a costume sewn for a Hollywood period piece. Now, the costume may have been sewn in 2022, but it might be historically accurate to the 1800s. Now, somebody will say, but it was sewn in 2022. Okay, yes, this individual specimen may have come into existence in 2022, but its typological features are in adherence with the historical accuracy of the 19th century. In this video, when we're talking about medieval music, think in typological terms, not in terms of when the music was written, because that is ultimately irrelevant to what we're talking about. All right, so in order to understand how bardcore differs from medieval music, we have to understand that both are generated using different music theories. Bardcore employs modern Western music theory, and obviously medieval music uses medieval European music theory, which is an ancestor, even a distant ancestor of modern Western music theory. So what I want to do is look at what that entails in actual tangible terms. So I'm going to take a song, a French folk song called La Complainte de la Blanche Biche, and I'm going to arrange it the way a modern folk song would be in France today, using Western music theory, that is, using primarily the driving force of tonal harmony, which is the core of Western music theory. So the melody of the song goes like this. What Western music tends to do is work on the basis of a harmonic progression. What is a harmonic progression? Let's define harmony first. Harmony is the voluntary mixing of two pitches that are not the same pitch. That is the foundational aspect of modern Western music. It's like a cocktail, basically. What if I mix this ingredient with that ingredient? So harmony is whenever you mix, in a voluntary manner especially, two pitches that are not the same. Let's take this pitch and this pitch. If I sound them together at the same time, it gives me this. It gives me a specific harmony. If instead I sound together these two, it gives me a different form of harmony. And modern Western music tends to conceive of its harmony in a triadic form. Triadic because it uses triads, three-part harmonies, three different notes. Typically, that's what a chord means. A chord tends to be built off of three notes. So we have this point in the melody that goes da-da-da. When the melody lands on this part, that's a great strategic place in which to place a specific chord. Now, what chord do you want to use? I could use a D minor chord, for example. And this chord perfectly works if that's what you want, but for my arrangement of this song, it doesn't quite work. It's a little too heavy, it's a little too... It has a feeling of finality almost. That doesn't quite work. I need another chord. So how about this one? I like this one. I like this one because it has a sort of in media res kind of quality to it. It feels like it's bringing you in the middle of the story as events are already in motion. I like it, like it has a forward motion already. And then we move to the next harmony. So the melody goes... Right, so now that's another good strategic place on which to place a chord. Could be a D minor again. D minor certainly works, but I want something different. D minor is a little too depressing, it's a little too sad. So how about a major chord? A major chord tends to sound happier. How about an F major? Well, that's beautiful. Listen to the quality of it. and then it goes. Now, what chord do I use for this? Again, a D minor could also work here, but I want to go with a G major. That's the sound that I want. Again, why do I want that sound? Because that's just the story that I want to tell. And that's basically the core of the idea of the harmonic progression. A specific harmonic progression comes into being when you put a specific sequence of specific harmonies one after the other. So a harmony alone doesn't have as much meaning as when being accompanied with other harmonies. It's basically a form of language. And so harmonies themselves have meaning, and then when put in specific sequences, they have a different kind of meaning. And that's when you get the full, broad linguistic application of the harmonic progression as something that conveys a story, a meaning, a tone, an adventure, whatever you want to call it. So this harmonic progression here goes... That's the harmonic progression that I chose. And different songs will have different harmonic progressions. Or you can have a harmonic progression that goes... And harmonic progressions are the foundational skeleton of all Western music theory. Western music is defined by those harmonic progressions that are typically of a triadic and tonal functional nature, such as one that I've shown here. All right, so now let's go back to the example of the French folk song, La Complainte de la Blanche Biche, that I was arranging in the beginning. This is the finalized song with everything in it. So what you're hearing is a pretty typical way of arranging music, especially in the folk tradition, in the Western tradition of today. And this is what defines the sound of Bardcore music. Bardcore music will either write original songs with a medieval theme or arrange actual pieces of music from the Middle Ages using the framework of tonality, which is the framework of modern Western music theory. So if we actually isolate each one of the components, you can hear the main melody here on the harp. But underneath, you can also hear the harp adding in the triadic chords, hitting those blocks of 3 notes to support the main melody. Right, that's the chord progression that I was describing to you earlier. And then underneath that, I also have another structure overlaid, which is the same chords but arpeggiated. An arpeggiated chord is when you take a chord, right, that block of 3 notes, and instead of playing all those notes at the same time as a sequence of 3 notes stacked on top of one another simultaneously, instead you are going to stretch out those 3 notes and separate them over the rhythm of the song, and so it gives you this effect. Remember, those are the exact same chords as the ones above that we were just listening to. It's just that instead of playing them at the same time as one stack, you're separating them over the rhythm of the song to create a rhythmic effect. And then finally, I also have the same chords but strummed on a Siegel Merlin. And when they all coalesce together, they give you... And this is what people mean when they describe modern Western music as vertical in nature. Because you stack together distinct individual vertical structures that are not the same. They're rhythmically different, they're behaving differently, they're not the exact same melody, but all of them come together in order to create this harmonic vertical superstructure. And 99.99% of the music that most people perceive as being medieval is music that uses those elements that are anachronistic to the Middle Ages, that coalesce in the early modern era instead of the actual Middle Ages. elements that belong to modern Western music, to the tonal framework. So let's look at a few examples. Here we have Luc Arbogast, an amazingly talented musician, love his music, which is completely bardcore. And you can tell it's bardcore because if you listen to this rendition, he begins by singing the song with arpeggiated chords, exactly what I showed you. He's adding a harmonic support underneath his main voice using arpeggiated chords, which is completely anachronistic to the Middle Ages. And then he goes on fully embracing the harmonic aspect by strumming chords on his Irish bouzouki. And so the entire performance is underlined by harmonic progression in the style of modern Western music from after the early modern era, something that did not at all exist in the Middle Ages. This is Ameno, a song by the musical project Era, one of my favorite musical projects of all time. I grew up in France, where it's from. I've been listening to it since I was 7 years old in 2003. I bought the CD even earlier than that, 2002. It has a special place in my heart. Those songs are some of my favorites. They're also not medieval in any way whatsoever. The songs are completely modern. They've been written in the modern day and age. And more importantly, they're performed in a modern manner. There's harmony everywhere. The choir, the voices are singing different notes at the same time in order to harmonize together in a tonal triadic manner, and underneath the choir you have those synths doing a chord progression. This is entirely modern. This song literally is closer to a Taylor Swift song than anything created in the Middle Ages. This is Arani Zoltan's arrangement of Totus Floreo or Tempus es Iucundum. It's a song that was written in the Carmina Burana manuscripts. It's one of the few songs that actually has pneumatic notation with it. Now the neumes, the notes written down, are not very clear, so the melody that is typically sung is a speculative reconstruction. We can't be sure that this was the exact melody, not that it really matters anyway. This melody could have existed in the Middle Ages, so as long as it's performed in a historically accurate manner, then it will be medieval music, but in this case it's not. Whatever instrument you have underneath the bagpipes, it's some sort of string instrument like a guitar or an Irish bouzouki or whatever that's doing, again, a chord progression in the modern triadic contemporary Western manner. And Arani is also harmonizing with his own voice in a harmonic fashion of today. This is what I mean when I say that bardcore is kind of insidious in how it's difficult to tell it apart. Unless you really know music theory and you can really tell what a harmonic progression is, you'll have a hard time determining what is bardcore, because as far as most people are concerned, this sounds medieval, like it's so gritty, and the bagpipes and the drums, it sounds like it's right out of the 1200s, but it's absolutely not. That harmonic progression is completely anachronistic. It's like having a scene of a castle, basically, and then having a Ferrari from 2020 in the middle of that castle. It's just something completely anachronistic. Now it's here that an exceedingly important clarification must be made. Whenever you explain that modern Western music theory is based on the usage of harmony and chords, triadic ones mostly, and that medieval European music did not have those, often a lot of people's impression then is, oh, so medieval European music was just like modern Western music, but it just did not have chords. That is an oversimplification, and a mistake as critical as this is one that previous iterations of music historians have done. Well, if they just had melodies without harmony, then their music was basically a more primitive version of our music, and this could not be further from the truth. So what we're going to do is, we are going to look at medieval European music and how it functioned, and explain how modality was the primary driving function of that music theory, and why that's what made it complex in its own right.
The first thing to understand about modality is that it's not merely a tradition where harmony lacks. Modality is a framework through which you look at music, through which you conceptualize and approach music, and therefore the tools at your disposition, the strategies that you're going to think of are going to be completely different. When you are tonally minded, as are modern Western musicians and Bardcore musicians, when you approach a piece of music, you're always thinking in harmonic terms. How can I make the harmony sound good? What kind of harmony do I use? How do I use notes that coalesce together in order to create certain specific harmonies? But when you're a modal musician, instead, you're looking at the melody and the melody alone. How can I take this one melody and work with the tools that have to do with this one melody? How can I modify, accentuate, inflect that melody to give it a certain flavor, a certain sound? One of the best examples of a modal approach to music is a high degree of heterophony. Heterophony is what happens when, within a performance, everybody playing an instrument is playing the exact same melody. You don't have a vertical structure. You don't have arpeggios and another doing counterpoint and another doing this and that. If the melody, for example, is everybody's playing that exact same melody, but every single person is ornamenting that melody a little differently, twisting that melody in slightly different shapes, inflecting it differently. So let's take this passage from La Complainte de la Blanche Biche. The melody as taught and as written down, its basic skeleton consists at this point, in this place in the melody, of jumping from this note to this note. However, with a heterophonic approach, you can maintain that basis of the melody and then add little passing notes in between. Between those two notes, you find these two notes. If I, instead of jumping, add in those two extra notes in between, then I get this effect. And there's an information contained within these two notes. There's a certain sound that these two notes have. There's a certain emotion that the other version doesn't have. Well, the other version is also valid. It has its own effect. A tonally minded musician is going to think, what chord or what harmony can I place here to get a certain effect? But I want to go with a G major. How about this note with this note when mixed together? What effect are they going to give me? Whereas a heterophonic modal musician, on the other hand, is going to think, do I want to jump between these two notes directly, or do I instead want to use the information in between these two notes? This is why when you listen to performances of music from modal traditions, such as Greek music, Balkanic music, Middle Eastern music, etc., they tend to have a high degree of what is perceived as ornamentation by Western musicians. Listen again to that instrumental passage of Et Dame Jolie. Or compare Stella Splendens, the notes written down. In medieval music, when you were given a set of notes, the idea wasn't that you're going to play these notes exactly as written. That would have been madness from a medieval point of view. Instead, in the Middle Ages, the musician was a composer themselves. The musician was in situ during performance, using spontaneous improvisation. They would become a composer themselves. They would add to the composition that was written down. And this is one of the mistakes, this is one of the traps that earlier generations of music historians fell into. They could not understand the modal framework of medieval music because they were all trained classically in the tonal Western harmonic tradition. And so they looked at this tradition that's not tonal and harmonic, that's modal, that's melodic, that's horizontal, that doesn't stack independent vertical layers, but instead complexifies the one horizontal layer. And because they lacked the skill set, because they lacked the knowledge, because they weren't brought up in such a tradition, they looked at those pieces of music and they went, oh, these are primitive and simplistic because they have no harmony and they just have a series of notes. Well, sure, if you approach medieval music like this, you're going to get a very bland and simplistic result.
Mesdames jolies, mon cœur sans fossé, mais en votre baille, que ne sait vos pères.
But once you understand how a modal melodic framework works, then you get something like this.
Mesdames jolies, mon cœur sans fossé, mais en votre baille, que ne sait vos pères.
Something far more lively and complex in its own right. Modal traditions are horizontally and melodically complex, as opposed to vertically and harmonically complex. This is also something that was reflected in the vocal styles of most of medieval Europe. Now, I have an entire video dedicated to this, but basically, in the most oversimplified terms, the way that medieval Europeans sang was closer to how Balkaners, Corsicans, Andalusian Spanish, Middle Easterners, Greeks sing. That entire sort of highly ornamented vocal style is how they sang. They weren't relying on vertical structures and harmonic intervals to create complexity. They weren't relying on the mixture of notes primarily in order to tell their stories, in order to bring about nuances to their music. They had that one melodic line, and when you're dealing with that one melodic line, their solution, just like the solution is still today in the Middle East and Greece and the Balkans and Corsica, etc., is to complexify that one horizontal line, something that is perceived in the vocal performances of the day. Now, this is something that's usually lacking in most historical performances to this day. That is because of an institutional obstacle, if you will, where most people who create renditions of medieval music are Western Europeans from classical conservatories and everything. And so the colleagues that they can work with that can sing the music for them are classically Western trained. And so they bring in an anachronistic vocal style. So this is something that's still being worked on, but, you know, it's slowly being amended. You have ensembles like Ensemble Organum, for example, working closely with Corsican singers, for example, because Corsican traditional singing still retains that old European flavor of singing, of complexifying the horizontal line with a lot of ornamentation from a Western perspective.
Snart niemand gaat niemand schor, is
And this is why, since the beginning of this chapter, I've been referring to all of these things as ornamentations, en guillemets, as we say in French. I say guillemets in English, in quotation marks, because ornamentation is a very Eurocentric, Western-centric way of looking at this thing. Within the modal traditions, these aren't ornamentation. These are the music. These ornamentations are the main principal driver of musical expression. All right, now our exploration of modality versus tonality is done. So now I want to bring this back full circle to La Complainte dans la Blanche Biche, which is the song that I used as an example for how to perform, write, and conceptualize tonal music. First, I'm going to play to you a modal rendition of La Complainte de la Blanche Biche by Jean-François Dutertre, who was a French singer and songwriter who played traditional French music and who was a big proponent of modality. By now, you have a very tangible understanding of what it means to have a modal approach versus a tonal approach to music and how differently it will render the exact same melody.
Celles qui vont au bois, c'est la mer
J'ai grande peine en moi, je n'ose vous le dire. Je suis fille le jour et la nuit blanche bêche.
Celles qui vont au bois, c'est la mère et la fille. La mère va chantant et sa fille soupire. Que vous assoutirez ma blanche Marguerite. J'ai bien trop dire en moi et n'ose vous le dire.
A reaction that a lot of people have upon hearing historically informed performances of medieval music is always, it sounds weirdly Oriental or Arabic, it sounds weirdly Eastern, and that's a wrong way of looking at it. It sounds modal, it has a modal approach to music, and it just so happens that today the East still has modal music. But the idea that French music of the 12th century sounded Turkish is every bit as true as Turkish music sounded French back then. They both utilized a modal framework and a common root in the Greco-Roman tradition. Basically, the history of Western music is one where medieval European music began as a modal tradition that was very, very closely related to that of its Eastern neighbors in the Islamic world, in the Eastern Roman Empire, Greece, and etc. They were very much part of one musical continuum. This is why if you listen to a historically informed rendition of a 1200s French song, historically informed rendition of a Turkish song from about the same era, you get very similar sounds. And not because the Turks influenced the French or Europe was Orientalized. Stop thinking of this as Oriental. It's not Eastern, it's not Oriental. It's just modal. And modality isn't unique to the East. It's something that once defined Western European music also before it changed. And that's what I want to talk about, before it changed. Because harmony began existing in the European Middle Ages. The very basic ingredients of harmony began emerging in the European Middle Ages, and by the end of the Middle Ages, they coalesce and crystallize, especially in the early modern era, in the form that brings about tonality. Bardcore cannot be medieval European music because it's tonal music. And tonal music cannot be medieval European music because medieval European music is the ancestor of tonality. Medieval Europe is to Western harmony what Batman Begins is to Batman. It's the origin story of harmony, or at least that's where we get the earliest attestations. And the earliest attestations that we have of harmony in Europe are in the form of what we call organum. Now, organum is something that I've dedicated an entire video to until, so I'm just going to gloss over the details in this section. Go watch that video for the full thing. But basically, the earliest forms of harmony in Europe come in the form of organum. And organum consisted of transposing the exact same song up a fourth or a fifth and then singing it with the original key at the same time. This is La Complainte de la Blanche Biche harmonized with the modern tonal system. Now, let me play this to you using the earliest known forms of European harmony, organum. Yeah. Two completely different universes, harmonically speaking, altogether. That was the earliest form of European harmony. But as time goes on, verticality begins to complexify in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and you have the emergence of polyphony. Now, polyphony is a distinct form of verticality. The verticality that I described at the beginning of the video, the one that defines most mainstream forms of modern Western music and that defines Bardcore, is a type of verticality that we refer to as homophony. Homophony is when you have one main melody that is supported by a harmonic structure in the form of secondary and tertiary vertical structures overlaid on top of it. However, polyphony is when you have a melody and then you have just other melodies on top of it. Not structures that form chords and harmonic supports, literally just other melodies on top. That is what we refer to as polyphony. Let's take the Elder Scrolls theme, for example. The melody goes like this. Now, of course, in order to harmonize, I can just, do chords. Locum, descends, tabarnak, psychris. Tu veux jouer de la musique toi aussi? Tu prends pour un compositeur? Ah ouais, le psychris. So, of course, I can harmonize it using chords. So I can go... What I just did is an example of homophony. Renaissance music, for the most part, was not homophonic. It was primarily polyphonic. So instead of harmonizing by stacking chords made up of 3 notes and dropping them at specific points in the melody, instead you write a second melody that harmonizes with the specific intervals, with the specific notes of the first melody. So for example, I can go like this. So I'm playing the main melody. I also have a second melody underneath that goes like this. This is a completely distinct independent melody from the first one. It's its own melody. It could be its own main theme. Every single note is selected to specifically harmonize using the rules of the nascent tonal system of Western European harmony in the early modern era of the 1500s and the 1600s. So in classical harmony of the West, you want the distance between your notes that constitute a chord to be at least that of a third. So consider that you begin with this note. If you want to create a chord out of this note, you want to stack 2 more notes, and the second note has to be at least 3 intervals higher than this one. 3 intervals is this one. So that's our second interval. And then what's 3 intervals more than this one? And now you have a D minor chord. The stacking of intervals in this way, separated by thirds, is what defines classical Western functional harmony, the one that most often is used in Bardcore. So why is it that the second melody specifically chooses these notes? Because it harmonizes perfectly with the first melody, following the basic rule where all the notes have to be separated by at least a distance of a third. And this is not something that you find at all in other traditions. For example, in Serbian music, they love the sound of this. I made a song this winter called Lazar's Curse, and I'm using the typical drone form of harmonization that they use in the Balkans, and one of the voices is staying on this note, and then another one hits this note. And together they harmonize like this. You can be a Western trained classical musician and you go to the Balkans, you go to a Serb and you're like, oh my god, no, this is dissonant. This is not, you can't do that, it's dissonant. And a Serb is just gonna look at you and be like, boli me kurac. Then they're gonna drive off in their dacha listening to odd time signatures while, I don't know, fighting Albanians to death to reclaim Kosovo. Just a typical day in Serbia, the Balkans. Polyphony of the tonal system, as it was used in the Renaissance and onwards, was a very calculated form of polyphony, where every single one of the notes was subordinate to the other notes in a specific harmonic intervallic relationship. Medieval polyphony, on the other hand, was boli me kurac. It did not give a flying shit. Medieval polyphony was not about calculatingly creating a secondary voice that perfectly harmonizes with the other. Instead, it was just 2 independent horizontal structures that complement one another modally. If, for example, you have a melody that goes... In the Middle Ages, you would have the second instrumentalist just improvising a secondary voice and going... This is not perfectly harmonizing with the first one according to the rules of tonal Western music theory. According to tonal Western music theory, many of these notes in between are going to clash with the first melodies in a way that's considered dissonant. But that's the thing. Medieval harmony did not have concepts of dissonance and consonance, not in the way that tonal harmony does.
C'est que felant que ça, montestez souvent douce vers votre partie. Très douce dame courgeat, or Dieu ne croyez pas tant, c'est gens pleins d'envie.
Another aspect of medieval harmony was the continuous usage of drone intervals, namely the tonic, the perfect fourth, or the perfect fifth. So, for example, in many renditions of medieval music, what you will hear is throughout the entirety of the song.
Celles qui vont au bois, c'est la mère et la fille.
Alles leb ich mir werde, sieht min sündig Auge sieht. Das
Tempus est iocundum o virgines, modo con gaudete vos juvenes.
Again, this is something that you won't find in most bardcore music, because bardcore music is about creating drones, yes, but drones that have a harmonic progression. You can't just continually hear the tonic throughout the song, because that goes against tonal harmony. In tonal harmony, the drone underneath has to switch depending on what note the main melody has in order to harmonize with it perfectly. From a modern tonal perspective, medieval music was constantly dissonant all the time. But of course, they did not conceive it as dissonance because they did not have that idea. Ideas of consonance and dissonance in a tonal framework are completely anachronistic to the Middle Ages. Or you could have the constant drone of a perfect fifth, for example, something that I do in my rendition of Ivis Lolo. So in my rendition of Ivis Lolo, you have a constant drone of the tonic provided by the hurdy-gurdy, and then you have my voice constantly singing this note over the vocals.
Ivis Lolo lorenar la lebre, Ivis Lolo lorenar danzar, Ivis Lolo lorenar la lebre, Ivis Lolo lorenar danzar. Tote tres lo torn de l'aubre, Ivis Lolo lorenar la le.
Which again is very alien to modern Western tonal harmony, but you find it in Georgian music, you find it in some forms of Balkan harmonization, etc., etc. So yes, harmony did exist in the Middle Ages, but it was a very distinct, alien, and different form of harmony from today's modern Western harmony. In any case, as the Middle Ages progress, as you hit the 1300s and 1400s, tastes begin to change, and harmonic pursuits and vertical polyphonic pursuits become the primary driver of musical expertise, expression, and research in Western Europe. And by the time the Middle Ages draw to a close, everything has now shifted gears towards providing vertical harmonic structures. That becomes the priority of Western European music, which is why by the time you hit the 1500s, everything is about polyphony and verticality and harmony. And this is why in the early modern era, tonality as we know it crystallizes. So as you go across the Middle Ages, you see the gradual shift from modality to tonality. This is something that is very important for me to represent in my historically informed renditions of medieval music. So when you listen to my renditions of music from the 1100s,
Chevalier multestes quaris, quaneu avus faisa glamour, desturse des amoravit,
they have a fully modal sound to them. But then you hear my renditions of medieval music from the mid-1400s.
Deo gratias Anglia, rede pro victoria. Deo gratias Anglia, rede pro victoria.
And just listen to the vocal quality. While the first one has that Eastern modal kind of quality. The second one has these straight pitches in a very recognizable classical Western manner. Because by the time you're creating polyphony and harmony and you want harmonic structures and that becomes your priority, you want everybody to sing in a very straight manner, not waver their voice constantly, so that the harmonies are as clear and clean as possible. So the story of the Middle Ages is the story of the gradual shift from a modal tradition, one that was nigh indistinguishable from that of the Islamic world, from that of the Middle East, to a direct predecessor that is recognizably the predecessor of modern Western music as we know it today. And Bardcore is playing pseudo-medieval music using the musical language of today's descendant of the Middle Ages.
The Irish bouzouki. The Irish bouzouki is one of the main instruments of this whole bardcore new medieval genre. The musicians of this genre have a love affair with it. So Luc Arbogast, for example, Irish bouzouki. If you see them playing some instrument at medieval fairs, it tends to be an Irish bouzouki. It's absolutely everywhere. You can't go 5 minutes in the bardcore genre without seeing somebody playing that instrument. Now, is it a medieval instrument? No. In fact, it's a very modern instrument. It's so modern that the technology of photography is literally more ancient than the Irish bouzouki. So I just checked the date as I was editing the video, and it turns out the Irish bouzouki is from 1970. Humanity walked on the moon before that. The instrument that has become one of the main representatives of pop cultural medieval music is literally more recent than humanity walking on the moon. If at this point you still had any reservations about the non-historical modern nature of bardcore, I think this proves it more than anything. I don't think there's any better argument than that. So why would an instrument so modern come to be used so widely in bardcore music? Well, again, you have to remember, bardcore and new medieval music is the music of modern musicians who use modern Western music theory to write music about the Middle Ages. So they need instruments that can procure them with typical triadic chord progressions the way most Western music uses nowadays. And the thing about bardcore music is that it tries to emulate the sensibilities of modern Western folk music, and much of Western folk music is rooted in the usage of the acoustic guitar. That I think is one of the sort of, typical the campfire song, particularly just the acoustic guitar has a very folkish kind of sound to it. You've seen most people, a lot of people, they pick up a guitar and what do? They learn chords. You learn to sing the song and then you do chords accompanying the song. And so bardcore musicians need an instrument that can serve the function of an acoustic guitar, sound kind of like an acoustic guitar, and be easily played by them as if it were an acoustic guitar. And the Irish bouzouki fits the bill perfectly. It sounds pretty much like an acoustic guitar with minute differences. It can be played very similarly to an acoustic guitar. You can build chords with it. It's basically an acoustic guitar that serves the function of acoustic guitar, but it's not an acoustic guitar. Because if you were to use an actual acoustic guitar, well, you could see that it's a guitar. Most people know about it. It'd be like, that's weird. It's familiar. I know it's modern. I know it's not medieval. But the Irish bouzouki looks different enough and sounds different enough that somebody seeing it and doesn't know where it's from will see somebody in a medieval costume playing it and say, I guess it's medieval. And this principle of the Irish bouzouki to me perfectly sums up the entire philosophy of bardcore. It seems superficially medieval. It kind of feels medieval. But if you really know about it, you'll know that it's completely modern. Historically themed stuff is the illusion of historicity, but the actual foundation and the actual depth of the entire thing is completely modern. It's taking things that are completely modern and just superficially applying to them the faintest coat of paint of that which seems historical. And this is where things get important, because a lot of people will say that, well, bardcore is medieval music with a modern twist. No, it's not medieval music with a modern twist. In order for something to be fundamentally medieval music with a modern twist, then the foundation of the music has to be medieval. But as we've established with bardcore, it's not. The foundation of the music is entirely modern. Well, then it's modern music with a medieval twist. Well, that's where things become interesting, because the twist that seems historical, that makes the entire thing feel historical, isn't even medieval in the first place for the most part. take the Irish bouzouki, for example. That's the part that makes it feel medieval, and yet it's not even medieval. So Bardcore being modern music with a medieval twist may not even be a good summation of Bardcore. Instead, I think the best summation of Bardcore and the most honest one would be it's a form of music that in the intent and in the reception of the audience harkens to the Middle Ages, but the actual constituents of the music may have nothing to do with the Middle Ages, and that those parts which seemingly feel medieval may not even belong to the Middle Ages. As with most things medieval themed, Bardcore is about giving you a feeling, an illusion that you're experiencing the Middle Ages without actually having to commit to experiencing the Middle Ages as they were. I just want something historical, but not too much. I just want something that, makes me feel like the Middle Ages without actually having to commit to getting used to sounds that you're uncomfortable with, without having to commit to getting out of your comfort zone. There's this restaurant in Montreal called L'Auberge du Dragon Rouge, which is a medieval restaurant, a medieval themed restaurant. And again, it's themed. It's not literally medieval food, right? Because eating actual medieval food would require you to commit to getting out of your comfort zone. It would require you to eat intestines and spices that are weird. It's just like a completely different culinary tradition that's not at all meant for our modern tastes and everything. So you go to that restaurant and, the decor is medieval and the clothes are medieval, and the waiters and waitresses, they speak with a standard French accent. They say bonjour messieurs et mesdames, comment allez-vous? We're Québécois, we talk like bonjour, comment allez-vous? And yet they put on a standard metropolitan French accent. Why is that? Because we associate it with an ancient medieval sound here in Quebec, which is kind of funny because most metropolitan forms of French are less like medieval French pronunciation than our French. The way we speak French here in Quebec, on parle plus médiéval que les Français parlent médiéval, tabarnak. Bon, c'était pas pareil nécessairement, mais c'est beaucoup plus facile pour moi, mettons, de me mettre à prononcer des paroles de chansons médiévales françaises parce que, pour une grande part, notre phonologie moderne québécoise ressemble plus à la phonologie française médiévale que la phonologie métropolitaine française. But that's not what matters. Again, remember, Bardcore and medieval themed isn't about what actually is. It's about what seems. It's about the associations. We associate modern metropolitan French with medievalness, so whenever people are doing live action roleplay or doing these medieval fairs or doing these medieval themed restaurants, they put on a European French accent. And you sit down and the food isn't intestines and eyes and whatever they ate in the Middle Ages that was very sort of, unusual to our tastes. It's burgers with fries. Of course, they're not cold burgers with fries, right? The bread is a little different. It's decorated and the meat is a little different. And, the fries, they're cut more like traditional potatoes. They have some like pepper on them. And they're not cold burger with fries. They're given a fancy medieval sounding name. But at the end of the day, you're eating a burger with fucking fries. Which, by the way, there's no problem with that inherently. I'm not saying that's bad. Yeah, sometimes maybe I want to eat intestines. I love kokorech. But sometimes I just want to eat a fucking burger with fries. And sure, if you have an in-between of, I just want to experience a mood of what I think is medieval, but I just want to eat food that's in my comfort zone, that's perfectly fine. And that's exactly what Bardcore is. Bardcore is built on the foundation of getting to experience an illusion of the Middle Ages without having to actually commit to getting out of your comfort zone to experience the actual Middle Ages. My previous Epic Talking video was on the subject of Orientalism. Orientalism being a vibe devised by Western media that represents the Middle East. Now, this vibe isn't an actual representation of the actual Middle East. For example, in Orientalist soundtracks, you'll have an Indian instrument and an Armenian instrument thrown together with Arabic vocals to represent ancient Egypt for some reason. That's the equivalent of having banjo music with Dutch lyrics over a scene of the Soviet Union, non-ironically, non-comedically, like as an actual serious way to represent the Soviet Union in a soundtrack. That would, of course, never fly with Western audiences. But the same level of nonsensical cultural mishmash manages to fly when it comes to the Middle East because Western audiences are unfamiliar enough that they can vibe to this. Because see, a lot of people say, but Orientalism is just a vibe, bro. Who cares? Well, that's the thing. It's a vibe that you can vibe to if you're not from the region. But anybody who's from the region or anybody who has minimal familiarity with the region will have a hard time vibing with it because they're too busy feeling jarred. And as much as we may like to think that these vibes-based system are just the artists being creative, yes, it is the artists being creative, but their creativity is dictated by the context in which they're operating. And if the context in which they're operating is a context of sufficient unfamiliarity of the audience when it comes to what they represent, they have more leeway to do whatever they want. Because again, people are like, oh, Hollywood composers are just using the Armenian duduk for India only because it's their free artistic interpretation. Bullshit. Where's the free artistic interpretation of the banjo for Russia? Why does that level of free interpretation not occur when it comes to cultures that are well known and understood? It doesn't occur because those cultures are too well known and understood. And those artists cannot get away with this, so they're not even thinking of doing it in the first place. It's the same fundamental principle that applies to Bardcore, LARPing, medieval fairs. This whole pseudo-representation of the Middle Ages, it may seem medieval if the only idea you have of the Middle Ages is a distant, faraway, superficial one, which is the idea that most people have. Most people aren't connected to the Middle Ages in the way that they are to, well, their immediate surroundings. There's this old saying that the past is a foreign country. Because of that unfamiliarity, most people can't tell whether a piece of armor is from England in the 10th century or whether this piece of clothing is from Hungary in the 9th century. It just all looks like a big mush. And whenever something is just a big mush as far as you're concerned, you get free reign to treat it as a big mush and throw in elements without people knowing any better. That's why you get an instrument from the 1970s. These instruments were not chosen carefully because of any historical rationales. You cannot rationalize the Irish bouzouki, an instrument from the 1970s, based on a Greek instrument that is at most 150 years old. In historically informed performances of medieval music, if an instrument was chosen, it's because research was done and the research concluded that this instrument was used in that era. The scientific method is what brings about the sound of historical medieval reconstructions. But Bardcore is not based on any historical rationales whatsoever. There's no thought, scientifically speaking or historically speaking, put behind any of it. It's just, this instrument sounds cool, and it kind of feels medieval. What do you mean it feels medieval? It feels medieval. It's a vibes-based system. The ignorance of the audience is the primary ingredient in the formation of these vibes. Because again, fans of Bardcore and LARPing will feel like I'm invalidating something that they like, and they'll say, but it's just a vibe that we're enjoying. Yeah, cool, but there is no vibe of, people unironically using banjos to represent the Soviet Union, because we're way too familiar with where the banjo is from and what the Soviet Union is and what the associated instruments with that culture were. Our lack of familiarity and ignorance of the Middle Ages as a collective pop culture is the primary ingredient in why Bardcore and this whole pseudo-medieval aesthetic managed to exist and thrive in the first place. If we were more familiar with it, we would be too jarred in order to even be able to cultivate it in the first place. In the same way that the pop cultural image of the Norse continues to evolve over time, in the 1800s you had this heroic idea of the Norse as these Leif Erikson winged helmet kind of figures, and nowadays you have this gritty Siberian Native American shamanistic inspired vibe of Wardruna and Heilung in how we view the Norse. In the same way, the Middle Ages will keep evolving, and every subsequent generation will have its own version of the Middle Ages. You will always have the Middle Ages as it existed in the past, and our closest approximation of it using historical research and the scientific method. And then you will have the Victorian era version of the Middle Ages, that romanticized, heroic, chivalric version, and then our modern contemporary version, which is a little more deconstructive with 2010's Robin Hood. And there's something valuable in that. These versions of the Middle Ages are a reflection of the contemporary era that is observing said Middle Ages. It's that era's version of the Middle Ages, and that says a lot about that era. See, this entire modern aesthetic of the Middle Ages and Bardcore, which is its musical expression, these are valuable in that they reveal a lot about who we are. They reveal about what the kind of music that we like is, where our priorities lie, where our tastes lie.
And so Bardcore is very much valuable. It's just that its value is not historical. It is a reflection of who we are, using the Middle Ages as a mirror, an analogy. But really, it says everything about us, and it says almost nothing about the Middle Ages.